Thank you. I'm very pleased that I am able to introduce Dr. Betty Edwards. I haven't known her very long, but I can tell you that she is very fascinating. She's helped me tremendously with the conversations we've had in the past 2 days. I was trying to think of a way to kind of sum up what she means to anyone who is going on a creative search, and I found that was impossible. So what I will do instead is sort of synthesize who she is and introduce you to her so she can explain it yourself. I hope she is as fascinating to you as she has been to me. Dr. Edwards is currently the director for the Center of Educational Applications of Brain Hemisphere Research and professor in art at California State University, Long Beach. She has a Doctor of Education degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Edwards has received the Achievement Award for Distinguished Scholarly and Creative Activity at California State University. She has several publications, including Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which is widely used as a textbook in a variety of disciplines. It has been translated into 10 languages. Her other book, Drawing on the Artist Within, has been translated thus far into 8 languages. I give you Dr. Betty Edwards.
Thank you, lovely, that was great. Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm honored indeed to be here this evening as part of this really wonderful series of lectures. I'm particularly proud to be standing in the place of Morris Sendak. I'm sure that many of you grew up with his illustrations, as did my children, and I myself was very disappointed that he was unable to come. My subject this evening is creative thinking, new ways to look at creative thinking through my special field of drawing. I think we'll start with the slides. I incidentally want to thank very much Paul Lesso and especially Christine Paul for all of their efforts on my behalf in making it possible for me to be here. See if we can get the mechanism working. Oh, good. I like to start these presentations with a drawing of the old bean itself. I think it's important to remind ourselves that in every skull in this room, there is this organ working away, mostly out of control, I think, for most of us. And really, much of the work I'll be presenting to you tonight has the purpose of suggesting some ways to get the old bean under a little bit better control. Now, the work that I'm presenting to you is based on the scientific work, the brain hemisphere work of Roger Sperry, psychobiologist at Caltech, whose work was first published in 1968. That work has gone into the popular culture. This is a cartoon which the woman is saying, the right side of my brain says yes, but I'm waiting to hear from the left side of my brain. Now, the cartoonist here has gotten the research right, has done his, in this case, his homework. This next slide is an advertisement. Perhaps many of you have seen these ads coming out recently. Apparently, the assumption is that brain hemisphere work is common knowledge, and I quite believe it is. Now, a painter arrived at my house one day wearing a t-shirt that said, "I dig the right side of your brain." So I think surely it has gone into the popular culture. This cover appeared on Business Week magazine a few years back, asking the question, are you creative? Now, businesses are searching for creative people. are searching avidly for good problem solvers. Our culture is in need of this. Corporations are feeling the need. And they're tapping into, I think, quite a natural wish that most people have to be more creative. From a book called Management and the Brain, I want to present to you what I believe to be a really brilliant metaphor for left hemisphere, right hemisphere. And this is called the Star Trek model of brain management, in which Mr. Spock from that series represents the left hemisphere. And if you think of that character, you see that he's right for this role. He deals with the facts. He is not emotional. He really does not make judgments. He simply gathers data and presents the data. The right hemisphere is represented by Dr. McCoy, who is, unfortunately, in my opinion, represented in this series as the weakest of the crew, somewhat emotional and a little bit unreliable, when the research is quite clear, as a matter of fact, that right hemisphere is extremely powerful and quite efficient. Scotty and the crew represent the old brain, or the visceral brain, down there taking care of the nuts and bolts of this space voyage. And significantly for the work I'll present this evening, Captain Kirk represents the so-called executive of the brain. Now, in brain research, as well as left hemisphere, right hemisphere, the old brain, there is postulated to be a sort of captain of the ship. The executive is sometimes actually called the executive of the brain, sometimes called the hidden observer of the brain. So I am suggesting tonight that there are ways in which, certainly I'm trying myself to become a better Captain Kirk of my own brain. Now, in this model, Captain Kirk takes information from both hemispheres. That is, from Mr. Spock, he gets the data and the information that's needed. Dr. McCoy, his role is to take care of the emotional ambience, to monitor what's going on in the whole situation. And Captain Kirk's job is to take information from Scotty and the crew, Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy, and then to make a decision based on best information coming from all sides. The suggestion is then to, in a strange way, step outside one's own brain. I know you're doing this anyway. One does this quite subconsciously. Looking back to decide which mode to be in, which is appropriate to the job, taking the information and then making a judgment based on best information. It's a very interesting idea to be in this rather new relationship to one's own brain. Now, just a quick review of the brain hemisphere work. This will all be quite familiar to you. For how many left-handers do we have here tonight? Aha, hands. Keep your hands up, please. Right. Okay, sprinkled right through the audience. This is interesting. In many audiences, the left-handers all sit over there for reasons that are not clear. But in this audience, really sprinkled right through the crowd. In human populations around the world, there are about 10% left-handers. And that looks to be about the percentage in this audience tonight. Now, left hemisphere, for most individuals in this audience, excluding a few of the left-handers, not all, but a few, for most of us here this evening, language is located in the left hemisphere. And along with language, a way of thinking, which is characterized here in this list. Left hemisphere uses language, likes language, is analytic, uses symbols, words, numbers, and so on, tends to abstract out of reality, to abstract out the significant parts, the details, so to speak, keeps track of time and is interested in time, is rational, in its own terms rational, that is, says things like if A is true and B is true, then C is necessarily true. Now, I must remind you that the left hemisphere calls itself rational. In the beginning, when languages were made up, those languages were made up by someone's left hemisphere. Left hemisphere gave itself all the good words, you see. Calls itself rational and calls its silent partner irrational or non-rational. Is digital, left hemisphere likes numbers and words, is logical, again in its terms, is logical, calls its silent partner illogical, and in essence uses a system of thinking that is linear. Things strung out in strings, like words in a sentence. Dot, 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 like a digital computer, actually. Now, in the meantime, right hemisphere is processing different information. Given the same event, is processing that event differently, is nonverbal, that is, language is not its thing. It knows some words, but the strings strung out are really too slow for it. Right hemisphere deals with visual, perceptual information, tends to synthesize, put things together into wholes, is concrete in the sense that it deals with the here and now, what is actually in reality going on. I think, in fact, is even perhaps against its will, is forced to confront reality. Is analogic, that is, deals with analogs and metaphors, cannot keep track of time. Those of you who've been working on projects and find that you have worked all night without realizing that time has passed, you have been in right mode or right hemisphere. Is non-rational, again, called non-rational, mainly because we don't understand how it works, is too fast, too powerful, really to comprehend at our present level of understanding. Is spatial, and this is the connection with my field of drawing, is intuitive, and again, we call it intuitive because we don't know how it works. How does it come up with creative ideas? And in essence, this system is global or holistic, this way of thinking. Now, given this event here tonight, my speaking to you, in every brain in this room, this event is being processed in these two fundamentally different ways. Your language hemisphere is decoding the words, listening for the sentences, watching for what I hope is a logical presentation of ideas, and so on. At the same time, your visual system is watching the body language, watching the gestures, watching facial expression, aware of this whole situation, the complete emotional ambience of this whole situation, and is essentially dealing with visual, is not listening to the words. not interested, is dealing with visual perceptual information. Now, if these two sets of information are congruent, the second set, R mode, stays somewhat out of consciousness, and one is able to listen to the words and follow the train of thought in the sentences. If these two things are not congruent, that is, if the gestures and the body language do not fit what's being said, then this R mode, as a rare case, actually comes into consciousness, and one becomes aware that these two things are not fitting together. For example, as a native Californian, I can say to you that I think this was Richard Nixon's problem from the very beginning. I mean, he just could never get those two things working together, whereas our just past president, Mr. Reagan, was a master of fitting his facial expression, his gestures, to the words he was reading on the 3x5 cards, you see. And because of this, people felt very comfortable when he was talking. It was only later you went away and you said to yourself, hey, wait a minute now, what was it he said last week? Or something like that. So these two modes are going on. Our mode is out of consciousness. And part of my interest here tonight is to bring that second mode up to greater conscious level. Now, we're going to do a little exercise that will illustrate that, but let me give you a couple of examples out of ordinary life that I think illustrate these two modes. A good illustration of left mode or left hemisphere activity is balancing your checkbook. You see, where you follow a set procedure using words and numbers, you make an assumption that if you've done everything right, kept all the records right, that you will arrive at a 0-0 at the bottom line. Now, right hemisphere is not interested in this process, and if in fact there is some error and you get to the bottom and it says you have a balance of, say, $1.06, right hemisphere will say, let's just erase that and put a couple of zeros there because it doesn't really matter. Left hemisphere says, no, we must go back to the beginning and do it all again to find the error. Now, an example from ordinary life of right hemisphere mode is, I think, driving on the freeway. How many in this audience do a lot of creative thinking while driving on the freeways? Aha. And have any of you ever gone right past your destination and didn't even know it? Or maybe you've had this experience where you are aware that you got into the car and you're aware of arriving at your destination, but what went on between is lost in thought. Now, clearly, driving requires visual, spatial, perceptual processing. And this is very difficult processing because the information is moving at a rapid rate. If you were driving in L mode, you would have to be talking to yourself like this. Now the Buick is approaching from the left at 60 miles per hour and will overtake in 4.2 seconds. Now the Dodge. And you can see this system is too slow for for freeway driving. And therefore, I think left hemisphere, which will never admit it can't do something, by the way, and which lies all the time anyway, says in effect, I don't like to drive. We'll let old stupid do this, and I'll go take a little nap. And And left hemisphere apparently cuts out, goes into alpha, drops out of the task. Right hemisphere then, which is fragile and ephemeral, is able then to come forward, to do this difficult task of processing rapidly moving visual information, and is powerful enough to go to creative problem solving at the same time. This is a powerful system. And also this mode of thinking creates a state of consciousness which is extremely pleasurable. One is alert, feeling self-confident, you feel good, you're focused on the task or the thinking about the problem you're working on, and you feel confident that you will find the answer. You feel good. I should mention that human beings have found many substances, chemical and otherwise, and practices that cause a shift to our mode. Alcohol, drugs of all kinds, meditation, hypnosis, the list is quite long. As I say to my students, drawing is cheaper, it's legal, and you get to have the drawing as a result of it. You don't just come out of meditation or hypnosis. Drawing creates a shift into our mode. Now, if you have if we sort of ran out of packets of material, but if you have in the handout this little vase faces exercise, how many have the handouts? Can I see hands? That seems to be enough. The rest of you can do this exercise if you just have a piece of paper, and you can draw one half of this visual, perceptual illusion drawing, which is known as the vase faces drawing. Okay, now this little exercise is designed to illustrate the possibility of conflict between Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy, between left hemisphere and right hemisphere. So let me give you the instructions for this drawing, and then if you will become for a moment Captain Kirk and self-observe while you're completing this drawing to see what happens. So these are the instructions. Don't talk to each other while you're doing this. These are the instructions. If you have a plain sheet of paper, if you draw a line across the top and a line across the bottom, and if you are right-handed, if you would just copy off one of these profiles on one side. And those of you who have the handouts have this pattern. Now, what I want you to do is obviously to complete the drawing. This can be seen two ways, either as two facing profiles, or viewed in another way, can be seen as a symmetrical vase in the center. Your job is to complete the second profile, which will inadvertently complete the symmetrical vase in the center. Before you do that, however, I'd like you to take your pencil and simply redraw the existing profile, naming the parts as you go, like this: forehead, nose, upper lip, lower lip, chin, and neck. Really thinking to yourself what those terms mean. Then go to the other side and begin to draw the facing profile, which will complete the symmetrical vase. When you get somewhere on the forehead perhaps, you may sense within your own mind some conflict or confusion. And the purpose of this exercise is for you to self-observe, how do you solve the problem? Okay, let's take a couple of minutes to do this. Okay, it sounds as though you're about finished. If you're still drawing, can just continue. How many of you did, in fact, experience some, can I see hands, confusion or conflict in doing this? Aha. Did anyone in this audience experience paralysis? I mean, you know, where you get to a point you don't know which way to go, one way or another. Anyone here? Yes. Can you tell me what happened on that? You got to the chin and? Okay, he said I couldn't figure out which way to dip it in. How did you solve that? That's a good way to do. Did that work for you? Okay, and did you get a symmetrical vase then? Oh, good. Okay, great. Were you surprised at the extent of the paralysis? Right. Yeah, right. Okay, now that moment when you instructed yourself, look at the other side, that was being Captain Kirk. That was controlling this, you know, jazz that goes on. Anyone else have paralysis? Yes, please. The question is, what would happen if you just look up and don't pay any attention to copying the other side? You would have less paralysis, but you wouldn't get a symmetrical vase, you see. This problem is set up to produce this kind of conflict so that you would escape the paralysis but fail the design, the drawing problem on that. Is that what you did? Did that work for you? No kidding. Okay, there's always an exception to the rule. Anyone else? Let's take one more who had, or just did some odd experience with it. Anyone else? Okay, there are dozens of solutions to this problem, which people find intuitively. Did any of you say consciously to yourself, don't think about the names of the features? Just look at the space between. Did anyone start at the bottom and work up? Hands on that? Yes. Did you think you were cheating when you did that? You're not. I mean, the right hemisphere, you have to remember, is rather like Harpo Marx swinging from the chandelier. Anything that works, right hemisphere will do. Now, the reason this exercise sets up conflict is that in giving the instructions, I plug in strongly the names of the features, in other words, activating left hemisphere. And then I give you a problem which really can only be done visually and perceptually. And the conflict comes from having to make that shift over to the visual perceptual system. Often experienced at this little crunch, sometimes experienced as pure paralysis where you really cannot go any further with it. Okay, this is a set of vase faces drawings by Jasper Johns, the contemporary American artist who's used a lot of these patterns. Now, if we look at another set of drawings that illustrate two ways of looking, again, an analytic, symbolic way, the drawing on the right-hand side of the screen, comes from the left hemisphere, which says, looking at the chrysanthemum says, what is the basic shape that I can use for a chrysanthemum petal that will express that and that I can use over and over? I've got it, left hemisphere said, we'll use this little loop and we can do it over and over again and that will stand for chrysanthemum petal. And what is the symbol for leaf, and what is the symbol for stem? Now, to look at the R mode, or right hemisphere way of addressing this problem, the drawing on the left by the great Dutch artist Piet Mondrian illustrates the method of the right hemisphere, which is to take in complexity, will deal with complexity of a very high level, wanting not a symbolic form, but rather to be able to express in all of its complexity this unique chrysanthemum in this unique situation, is willing to look at each chrysanthemum petal as a unique instance which is in a relationship to all the other petals, and will take up that task because it has no sense of time. It does not get bored with the task, and will work as long as it's not interrupted to produce this kind of complexity. Now this, I think, is what the left hemisphere cannot stand about the right hemisphere. That left hemisphere would say, in effect, why go to all that trouble? Mine is just as good, tells the story. I can use it over and over again. But when one is doing creative problem solving, it is often necessary to really see what is out there, not what you think is there or what you decide is there, but what is really there. And this, I think, is the value of learning how to draw. This is the value of it. And also to control these brain shifts. This is a little in joke for the art community, the progression from complexity to simplicity. This is progression from left mode from right mode to R mode. A little cartoon which illustrates the left hemisphere's bias. I'm leaving out the cows, there are just too many of them. And the boss behind, we all have to deal with this boss behind who says, that should take care of any more brilliant ideas from the right hemisphere of your brain. And he's got his club out. Now, returning to the question of creativity, the characteristics that you see listed here are well known in terms of creativity, independence, strong motivation, openness to new ideas, certainly curiosity, one of the prime human qualities and essential to creativity. But as we look further into characteristics of creative people, we begin to find references to the visual system. And in my research on creativity, over and over again, it turned out that creative people are extremely visual, tend to see things in images, and arrive at ideas through, well, what we see here, an ability to scan ideas and thoughts, the ability to concentrate attention and to shift it appropriately. Right hemisphere mode is a mode of extreme concentration. It is not daydreaming. It is a focused and really quite extreme concentration on the task at hand. The ability to combine bits into new combinations. One of the characteristics of right hemisphere is its interest in what is called fit. How do parts fit together to form a whole? Left hemisphere tends to deal with the parts as separate entities, whereas the right hemisphere is always seeking to fit bits into a whole, to fit them in their appropriate place. And finally, the ability to perceive underlying patterns even where parts of the information are missing. Now, anyone who balances his or her checkbook knows that when left hemisphere comes to missing information, it comes to a grinding halt. You know, if you've forgotten to register a check in your checkbook, left hemisphere throws up its hands and says, well, you know, that's it. I can't go any further until we fill in that information. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, can extrapolate from given information to envision what is missing. And in this way is able to leap over missing information, to, in a sense, to fill it in an imaginary sense. So that in our language we find references to this system, the visual system. And we have phrases which are familiar, but which I think often we don't think what they really imply. To see the whole picture, to gain insight, to see the forest for the trees, to gain a new perspective on the problem, to see things in a new light, to throw light on old problems. These phrases go on and on and on, always referring again to the importance of visual information in problem solving. Now, if you test yourself out on some quite well-known illusion drawings, you can see this shift in thinking, like the vase faces, so that this trick drawing is quite well known actually, can be seen either as a duck or alternatively, and with equal validity, as a rabbit. I hear the ahas as they come out. Now, if you sort of monitor your own brain as you're doing this, that you're scanning this image and then making this shift. There are a few people who can see both at once. Anyone in this audience can see both? Terrific. I tend to shift. Okay, let's up the ante a little bit more. This drawing from the 20s, I regret to say, is known as the wife-mistress drawing. It can be seen either as an old hag, either as a young girl looking back over her shoulder, or as an old hag with her chin sunk into her fur-collared coat. And we will not go into which is the wife and which is the mistress in this drawing. Now, again, watch your own brain as you're scanning this information. You see the males tend to see the young girl first. You see perhaps one, you know the other's there, and you're scanning, looking to see where is the other one. We'll hear the ahas. Help the people in the, it's just excruciating if I move on and you haven't found them both. Help your seatmates if they haven't seen it. Aha, we hear the ahas. Okay, now these ahas are actually quite like creative problem solving. Okay, I hope everyone has seen it. Okay, the young girl, I usually work with a light pointer so I can point these out. I have to say that when I finished my second book, I don't know if you can see this, but I really felt constrained to do a husband-lover, which you see here on the right-hand side. I don't know if you can see them both. These drawings are interesting to try to conjure up. Now, we've come then to the nitty-gritty question. If one of the goals of creative problem solving is to learn how to shift from mode to mode, if in fact in any field you're in, you're confronted with problems which are essentially linear or essentially visual, and our job as Captain Kirk is to be able to look at whatever problem, no matter what the field, to look at whatever problem and make a decision as to which mode of thinking or which combination of right hemisphere and left hemisphere is best to use to address that problem. And having made that decision, for example, in vase faces, yes, left mode to name the features, then a shift to right mode to accomplish the drawing. And the nitty-gritty question is, how do I do that? When my task is to balance my checkbook, how do I keep right hemisphere from getting involved in it? When my job is to drive on the freeway, how do I stay in that mode and not get pulled out, which incidentally, carpooling does. You know, this is the reason no one wants to carpool, is that right hemisphere is so enjoyable. So the model then for making this shift is really a very simple statement. And I'll just repeat this. In order to access this fragile and ephemeral way of addressing problems, of thinking, it is necessary to present your own brain, and this means to be in control enough to present your brain, that is to direct your attention to information, to a task which the left brain will turn down. Now, let me repeat that, because I think actually of all of the work that I've done, I do think that this is my really single contribution to the right hemisphere story, that this is the strategy. In order to gain access to right hemisphere mode, difficult to access, it is necessary to present your brain with a job which your left hemisphere will reject, like freeway driving, for example. In other words, you can't say to your left hemisphere, now you get out of the job because I want to draw now. Left hemisphere will say, I can draw. Here it is, chrysanthemum, I've got it. Here it is. But it is amenable to being tricked out of the job. And I'll show, this is one of our major tricks, is upside down drawing. Those of you who have this packet will have a copy of this, have a packet of materials, will have this drawing. And if perhaps you think you can't draw, if you turn the drawing upside down like this and copy it, you will find that you can draw if the information is upside down. Now this is a powerful technique, and the reasons why upside down is so powerful are still unclear. But apparently left hemisphere simply cuts out, says in effect, I don't deal with upside down. And if you're going to do that, I'm out of it. Well, terrific. Now, your copy will also be done upside down. And in this way, you will avoid the naming and categorizing, which is the left hemisphere's favorite thing to do, and to keep it out of the job, to trick it out of the job, actually. Next, I will show you an example. This student misunderstood the instructions and did this drawing right side up, copying the Picasso. Here you can almost hear his left hemisphere talking. Yes, here's this guy, he's wearing glasses. I've got glasses. We can do that. Sitting in a chair, I've got that. And I'll just leave the hands off because hands are too hard to draw anyway. So the next day, the student came in and I said, look, you misunderstood, and go do the drawing now upside down. And the same student the next day did this drawing upside down. Now, you cannot get from here to here in one day, no matter how effective the instruction is. So one must assume then that there simply a different process in the brain is being used to attack the problem. Now, what does this mean? I think what this means is that in every brain in this room, the function to see well enough to draw, to see what's out there in reality, is in this brain, every brain in this room, right now, if we can gain access to it. In other words, that all of you can draw well, you have the capability, if we can gain access to it. And upside down drawing enables you to access that function, those functions of the brain, that area, if you will, of the brain. Now, if you want to try that out, the effect of upside down, if I say to you that the tree on the far side this way and the far side that way are the same size, especially those of you in the middle, those of you on the sides will be getting some distortion, that those two trees are the same size, you'll find that hard to believe. But if I turn this same slide upside down, suddenly that information becomes available. And we go back to the right side up, and that tree grows again against your will, and upside down. Now, what does this mean? This effect, of course, is called size constancy, a phenomenon of the brain. Why the brain changes information, we don't know, but it is changing information, as you can see if we go back to right side up, before it arises to level of awareness. And therefore, I mean, apparently to fit some concept that things that are far away appear to be smaller, and if they appear to be the same size, they must be a great deal larger. And therefore the brain enlarges the image before it arrives at conscious level. Whereas upside down, that process is cut out. Now, R.L. Gregory, the famous perception man, has said that only a trained artist can overcome the effects of size constancy. In other words, that training in perception enables one to overcome the changes in reality that the brain itself is doing and not telling you it is doing. In other words, one gains control over those processes through learning to draw. Now, what does that mean? Well, in terms of thinking, in terms of creative thinking, it means that you can see what's really out there. And this is perhaps one of the important tasks, human tasks, to try to see what's really there. Not what you think is there, not what your left hemisphere is telling you is there, what is really there. It's something we all desire. Now, I'm showing you now a slide of a painting by Van Gogh. It's been in the news lately, not this particular painting, but another of the irises. And I've been finding, in quizzing my students lately, that in an odd way, artistic ability is equated with creativity. That if one learns how to draw, one feels oneself to be more creative. If one is good at art, one has a higher opinion of one's creativity. How many of you agree with that? Hands on that? Yes, it's an interesting kind of linkage. I think it's very likely true, although it certainly is possible to be highly creative and not know anything at all about art. But in the popular view, it is equated, I think. Now, what I've been doing over the last 10 years is taking people who can't draw at all, like this young man, and the young man who did this drawing, and as you see, it goes back to '74. I still show this set of drawings because it's interesting from several standpoints. It was the first set of before and after drawings I ever kept. And this first drawing was of the same person as the after drawing. Now, the difference between these two drawings is rather like the chrysanthemum drawings. That is, this drawing is a drawing, an analytic, symbolic, systematic drawing, where the student looks at the model and says, well, we start with the eyes, and there are two. Left hemisphere always counts. And we'll use the symbol we've always used. Here it is, a little circle. Next, the nose. These are sequenced rigidly. The nose, we use the nose we've always used, and the mouth, and so on. Notices that the girl has long hair, which is sort of straight, but it also is a little curly. So both those things get plugged into the drawing. Now, this drawing, which at this time was done a year later, we've collapsed this time now to 5 days between these, as I'll show you as we go on. This drawing differs from the first mainly in terms of complexity. Some recent research shows that at a certain level of complexity, left hemisphere simply cuts out, cannot deal with complexity above a certain level. Right hemisphere, on the other hand, is not only can deal with complexity, but likes it. So in this drawing, for example, left hemisphere confronted with the problem of drawing that collar and the bow tie would say, in effect, if you think we're going to draw all that stuff, forget it. And if you want collar and bow tie, here it is, da, da, da. That's good enough. That tells the whole story. But right hemisphere gets interested in all of the relationships, in all of the details as they fit together into this entire relationship, and will spend untold time because it cannot tell time. This next set is a non-art major pre-instruction drawing and a post-instruction drawing of a fellow student. The next drawing, a drawing by an engineering student who had had drafting and had a pretty good eye for proportion, but had not drawn realistically. This is a self-portrait done in this semester class about 12 weeks later. The next drawing, this was by a 35-year-old lawyer. Lawyers are the worst, I'm telling you. I mean, this guy is drawing on about age level 4, you know. Rewarded by our culture in all social and economic ways. And this learning disability, which he has, would never be known unless he had come into this course to learn how to draw. You know, if a student has a reading disability, they've got all sorts of names for dyslexia and aphasia and so on. I've often thought that we should really have a term for this disability, perhaps dysartistica or dyspictoria or something, and then we could go get funding and do remediation and all of that. But the lawyer did very well. This was a drawing of a fellow student done 5 weeks later in a UCLA class. The next drawing, again by a non-art major, again, the symbolic forms coming out of childhood, memorized during childhood, during language acquisition, actually, which I think is the purpose of childhood drawing, to assist in language acquisition. and a post-instruction drawing by this accounting major. Beautiful drawing. This is a pre-instruction drawing by one of our art majors coming in as a freshman, drawing pretty high level, late high school level. And these students also improve their perceptual abilities in this drawing of a fellow student dressed in some props that we use, so that the drawing becomes deeper, and the seeing actually becomes deeper and more profound. And this set by this student, non-art major. And of course, the art teachers love this drawing because it's funny and strong and conceptual and so on. But the key point is that the student didn't. He hated it. He said, you know, I was doing this kind of drawing in junior high school. I want to be able to make things look real, which is a tremendous push for students, a tremendous wish to be able to make 3D, make things look real. And indeed, the student did learn to draw. This is a self-portrait done about 12 weeks later, in which I'm happy to say he retained his sense of humor and titled this drawing Self-Portrait with One Eye. This next drawing was a drawing also by an art major who found herself stuck in a kind of stylistic mode of drawing and was struggling to free herself from this. And she later sent me this self-portrait, which satisfied her need for realism, from which she said, I can now go on and do abstraction and do more creative kinds of artwork. It seems that realistic drawing is a stage ideally passed through around age 12, I think, but which almost must be passed through in order for the person to feel confident in their artistic abilities to go on. I think it's a stage which should not be skipped. And lastly, I have these funny drawings by a New York writer named Tony Schwartz. He's 37 years old. This was his pre-instruction drawing. You know, this is the drawing that little kids do of the big head with the arms that come out of the head. And here's this guy, Tony, a sophisticated and highly educated writer, drawing on age level we decided it was about 5 or 6 or so. And this drawing was done at the end of 5 days. Now, we have collapsed all of this instruction into a so-called killer class. This next slide shows Tony's 2 drawings side by side. And if you look at this, was a difference of 5 days now. Now, you look at these 2 drawings, and it really seems that it must be 2 separate individuals who did these drawings. It's hard to link the 2 together. And relative to what I've said previously, in a way, this is the case. That Tony did the first drawing. The first drawing comes out of left hemisphere symbolic, analytic, memorized forms. Second drawing comes out of visual, perceptual observation of what is really out there. So in a sense, as Barry himself has occasionally characterized the 2 hemispheres, in each brain in this room reside something like Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy, something like 2 personalities, each with its own needs, wishes, and desires, each with its own favorite things to do, each vying for control, for who picks up the job, for who will prevail, but one of those quote persons has language, that most powerful of human attainments, and with language can make its case to prevail. So our job as Captain Kirk, it seems to me, is to give that other quote, personality in the brain its chance, its time, to give it its training, to give it its favorite things to do. And I believe with great benefit to the whole person as a result of this. Now, how are we doing this in this? This is our so-called killer class, this 5-day class. We go 5 days, 8 hours a day, and it is really a killer. What are we doing in that class? We are teaching not drawing, but seeing. Not drawing techniques, but perceptual skills. And they are very few in number, which is why we can do this. Now, mind you, we're talking about drawing a perceived form. We're not talking about imaginal or abstraction, created forms, but to draw, the ability to draw a perceived form. You need to learn only 5 perceptual skills. How to see edges, where does one thing end and another thing begin? How to see spaces, how to see what is it, I need another arm, what is around, the shapes of spaces around and within the form, how to see relationships, new learning for our students, also how to see negative space, new learning, new pathways in the brain, no doubt. How to see lights and shadows, new learning for our students. Those 4 we teach. The 5th we talk a bit about, but we really don't teach it, and that is this skill of seeing the whole thing. That is the thingness of the thing, to see the thing itself, not just generic chrysanthemum or generic girl or man or whatever, but to see that person, to see that thing, really to see at last, which is really quite a thrilling experience. For those of you who've had it, know what I'm speaking about. Those of you who do not perhaps draw, perhaps have not had that experience of seeing in this special way. Frederick Frank, a great drawing teacher, said once, "That which I have not drawn, I have not seen." And in a way, I believe that's true, that somehow, by setting aside the left hemisphere, activating this mode of thinking, which can see what is really there, that one, for ever so brief a time, parts the curtain that separates us in general life from seeing what's really out there. The result of this is this sense of beauty, how beautiful this person is, how extraordinary the chrysanthemum is, how complex the real world, the natural world is, and how exceedingly beautiful. It's a very moving experience. How many in this room have had that experience? Oh, this is wonderful. You see this thing and you say, oh my word, I never noticed that. How could I have not seen that before? And this, I think, if for nothing else, is a persuasive argument for learning to draw. Having learned that, what is the use? The question often comes up if I'm working with business groups or people not involved in the arts. Question comes up, well, you know, I'm in business. What's the use of learning to draw? Well, I think the answer to that is actually a question. What's the use of learning to read? Well, the uses are endless. And the uses of learning how to see through drawing, I think, are endless in the same way. It's quite the twin of reading. even those techniques of doing realistic drawing, to be able to see the edges of a problem. Where does one thing end and another thing begin is important. To see the spaces of a problem. You know, the Japanese have ways of talking about this and thinking in these terms, whereas we have trouble even with the concept that spaces can be important. What lies within the space of a problem, and how big is that space relative to the objects? We tend to be objective, as we say, whereas other cultures are able to, as the Japanese say, to work within the space of a problem. And it really is through drawing that one really understands the importance of negative space. What are the relationships within a problem? How big is this relative to that? How can I see this problem relative to constants? The constants in drawing are vertical and horizontal, vertical and horizontal. The constants in problem solving may be, for example, time. I mean, we get 24 hours a day, that's constant, that's a constant. Maybe money, if the problem is involved with money. And one's job is to figure out what the constants are. What are the lights and shadows of the problem you're currently working on? What do you know right now? What is in the light where you can see it? And what lies in the shadow? And are you able to extrapolate, as one learns through light, shadow, and drawing, to extrapolate from what you can see to what is not seen yet, to extrapolate into the shadow from what is seen in the light. And finally, what is the thingness of this problem you're working on? What is it in itself? What is its nature and character? Not what you want it to be, and not what you think it is, but what is it really? How can I really see the character and nature of this problem? Now, I have here a few examples of these techniques. Pure contour drawing, and of the reasons why these techniques work, I think, fit the model that I gave to you. These drawings are drawings of the wrinkles in one's hand while one is drawing behind one's back like this, a curious procedure. And in this drawing, I think left hemisphere says, in effect, this is boring, too boring for words. As a friend of mine, on looking at one of these pure contour drawings for the first time, said, no one in their left mind would do a drawing like that. And this, I think, is true. The next drawing out is a complex drawing of your own hand, plugging in this highly complex detail, which the right hemisphere will pick up the job. Negative space, left hemisphere finding you focused on nothing, says in effect, I do not deal with nothing. I like only things I can name and categorize. If you're going to look at that stuff, I'm out of it. Again, terrific. And one then is able to see the spaces, the shapes of the spaces. And there's a saying in the art business that if you can solve the spaces of a painting or drawing or sculpture or architecture, you've solved the problem. It's terribly important. Another negative space drawing. The next relationships, which forces you to deal with paradox. How can this floor go off at these funny angles when I know it's flat? And the left hemisphere says you better draw that thing flat or it's not going to be right. Left hemisphere has great problems with paradox. Right hemisphere simply takes it in, says, you know, that's the way it looks. Left hemisphere would say, listen, don't tell me the lower leg is only 3 inches long because I know better, and you'd better draw that thing out, and so on. So the dealing with paradox is another very specific training in terms of drawing. Lights and shadows, the shapes of lights and shadows, which come actually from this photograph, translated in this into shapes of lights and shadows. Shown here, these shapes are quite abstract. As you see upside down, how unlikely these shapes are, all the way away from symbolic drawing, actually. A drawing by, light shadow drawing by Seurat. And then finally, our students do a profile drawing, and in this 5-day class, then the self-portrait. Now, briefly, where does that symbol system come from? It comes out of childhood. During the time that you learned, and I learned, language is linked to language. Perhaps you remember the landscape you did as a child, the corner sun, the lollipop trees, squirrel hole. Long Beach students are big on squirrel holes in the tree for some reason. We don't know why. Each of us in this room landed on a set of symbols that we liked, a way to draw eyes, a way to draw noses, and so on. In this drawing, you'll notice that in each of the figures, the little loopy hands are repeated, used over here for the cat's paws. In each of the figures, the eye symbol is the same, used over here for the cat's eyes. So this symbol system is quite like the alphabet, can be combined and recombined to draw anything the child wants to draw. And each of us became known for our particular set of symbols, known to teachers and peers, as shown in this next cartoon. The teacher is saying, "You must be Billy's parents, I'd recognize you anywhere." No, that this symbol system survives through childhood into junior high school when this kind of cartooning takes hold. And as you can see in this drawing, the nose is foreshortened. The student is trying to do a little light shadow work and is clearly trying to make things look realistic. And we'll go on with cartooning for a few years at least. I should add that the level of taste at this period is at an all-time low. It's just shown in this drawing. Teachers hate these drawings. But children at a very young age, working with upside-down drawing, this child was 5, did the Picasso, Stravinsky, another Picasso drawing, and did this lovely drawing of a vase of flowers at 5, from an actual vase of flowers at 5, and continued, taught by his mother who had worked with me, and by the time he was 7 years old was doing portraits and drawings in perspective of his own house and the most remarkable things. So we don't know how far down in age we could go with this kind of training, but the symbol system is important for language. So then, my main message to you tonight. This is a statement by by Crick, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist, who says, "Few people realize what an extraordinary accomplishment it is to be able to see it all. The main contribution of the relatively new field of AI, or artificial intelligence, has not been so much to solve problems of visual information handling as to show what tremendously difficult problems they are." Now, we really take for granted this visual system which enables us to drive the freeway, to recognize our friends, an enormously difficult task, as shown by the brain damage patients who cannot recognize faces, which enables us to draw a perceived object, to set down on paper our perceptions. This system is hardly trained at all in the school system. And I think the time has come that we're at a stage, perhaps an evolutionary stage, of a move into visual information processing, of learning how to see what's really out there and to think in purely visual terms. This is no news to all of you, born and bred on television, visual in extreme ways, in many instances, but perhaps for many of you, this system is largely untrained. And my main message tonight is to suggest that these skills are available to you. They're really not very hard. It's terribly satisfying, opening up new ways of thinking and new ways to solve problems. And finally then, this new knowledge about the two major modes of thinking of the human brain has important implications for all of us. Clearly, we have unused potential. I, for one, am waiting for someone to write the book, Music on the Right Side of the Brain. So I think that would be wonderful. And we have many hidden capabilities. By courageously seeking new ways of thinking, we can discover our untapped abilities, thus improving our usefulness to ourselves, to our associates, and to the society we live in. It was Einstein, of course, who reminded us that human beings, our world has changed in many ways, but what has not changed is our way of thinking. And it may be that in the decade ahead, in fact, those changes will occur. We have time for some questions, I think. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we'll take perhaps about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Those of you who are able to stay, that would be fun. Anyone have any? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
As part of UniverCity 90 at Ball State University, we've invited Dr. Betty Edwards to be a part of our events. Dr. Edwards is currently the director for the Center for the Educational Applications of Brain Hemisphere Research and professor in art at California State University, Long Beach. She has a Doctor of Education degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Edwards has received the Achievement Award for Distinguished Scholarly and Creative Activity at California State University. She has several publications, including Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which is widely used as a textbook in a variety of disciplines and has been translated into 10 languages, and Drawing on the Artist Within, which has been translated into, thus far, 8 languages. Welcome, Dr. Edwards.
Thank you, Christine.
Could you explain to us briefly about what the significance of these books are and what their meaning is for us?
My 2 books essentially try to connect, I've tried to connect brain hemisphere research with drawing, with the idea that people who cannot draw, once they understand how the brain handles visual information, that then they can proceed and learn this skill, which for reasons that are a bit unclear, many people want. People want to know how to draw for some reason. I shouldn't say that. I mean, really it is because it's a very joyful thing to do.
Well, could you explain to me what is the difference between the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain?
Well, briefly, these 2 modes of thinking largely located language in the left hemisphere and visual spatial functions in the right hemisphere for most people are fundamentally different. The verbal system, left hemisphere mainly, handles language, step-by-step thinking, the kind of thinking you do when you balance a checkbook, for example. Right hemisphere, on the other hand, as we say, hands being connected to hemisphere function, The right hemisphere handles visual, perceptual information. Recognizing faces, for example, goes on in the right hemisphere.
I can see the significance of this to people who want to learn to draw. I used a lot of your techniques when I was teaching drawing, and they really helped these students to see. But I'm curious as to where the significance lays for other disciplines. It says that a variety of disciplines use this as a textbook. Could you explain why someone outside of the visual fields would use this?
Well, essentially because the brain is involved in everything that human beings do. So that any activity relies on really how the person, a person in whatever field, uses that particular brain. And human beings are really interested in how their brains work. Here is this 3-pound organ, still largely not understood, that is, in its basic operation. How does it work? What is memory? Where is memory located? These are still mysteries, but people are interested. My book, I think, illuminates for people in whatever field some information about the brain, which is new, relatively new. The separation, difference between these two modes of thinking. And they find it interesting, I think.
Could you define for us then what talent means? There's some students that come in at freshman level at a university and they have a natural ability. Other students have more or less come up to me several times and said, I cannot draw.
I have no talent for drawing, yes.
Right, right.
Well, I no longer really believe in that concept. I think that perhaps brains do differ. Certain people learn certain things faster, have perhaps an aptitude. But from my experience over the last 10 years, the probability for being able to draw is just about the same probability as learning how to read. That is, given a brain which is sound, given a person who has learned how to read, that person can also learn how to draw. It's no more talent dependent than learning how to read. But there are certain things about drawing, just as there are, I think, certain things about reading, that must be shown to the person. They are very hard to discover on your own. And this, I think, is the source of this concept of talent. Certain individuals, I think, stumble across the strategies required for drawing. I think I was one of those persons, actually, because I drew as a child. And I was quite aware that I was doing something different, looking at things differently when I was drawing, even as a quite young child. Drawing is quite easy once you know these little tricks of seeing. And what I teach really are the strategies for seeing that enable a person to put that information into a drawing.
Why is it that some children stop at about age 10 or 11 level skill of drawing? Is this something that's in our educational system that's lacking, or is this something that we have put so many myths around that it is a magical skill, or everyone comes up and says, well, you can draw, you must have this little touch of magic?
Well, yes, Chrissy, but look, what if we decided that reading was a matter of talent, and that the best we could do would be to spread around a lot of books and watch to see which children picked up the book and tried to read and somehow stumbled across the way of unlocking that, decoding that information. We would then say, well, you know, Johnny can read because his grandmother read. you see. And the family is literate, we would say. And this is what we say about drawing. We do not teach the strategies. We do not expect that everyone can learn, as we do with reading. And therefore we spread around a lot of art materials and watch to see who is talented, you see. And about the same percentage of kids who are about the same percentage show up, quote, talented, as would show up if we did this with reading, you see. So we just need to teach these strategies in a very routine way and expect that everyone would learn.
How would you introduce these into the education system as it is right now? Is this something that's possible to start teaching our children that their visual world is just as important as the written word and logical sequencing?
Well, I think that elementary school teachers, art teachers, or the regular classroom teacher, first of all, we want to make sure they can draw themselves, that they have these perceptual skills, and we should simply transfer these to the students in a routine way. Now, the question comes up, well, what is the use of drawing if you're not going to be an artist? And I think really the answer to that is a question, what is the use of reading? You see. You know, we teach reading, but we do that because reading improves thinking, enables us to unlock information. I think we should be teaching seeing by means of drawing. We teach logical thinking by means of reading and writing and arithmetic. Teach seeing and visual spatial stuff by means of drawing, dance, movement, sports. Do this quite deliberately in order to improve thinking. Not to increase the number of artists in the world, because the culture doesn't support artists, the artists that we have, but to improve thinking, and most particularly creative thinking.
Where do you see us headed in the 90s? I've found at the university level that our students are a lot more visual than when I was growing up. They're getting it from MTV, they're getting it from their videos, games that they play. Do you see that as something that's an education of the right brain mode? And if so, should we be controlling that to something?
Well, I think the control has long since is no longer possible. It's out there. Yes, in a way, certainly video games are tremendous training devices for right hemisphere processing. But the end product, I think, is not as valued or valuable to the person, because still it has not arrived at conscious level the possibility of using these two modes of thinking at conscious level. This is the job of educators, I think.
You were talking about a seminar you did with Bell Laboratories. Could you tell me why they would be inviting a drawing professor to speak with them?
To improve creative thinking, creative problem solving. That was the purpose, and that's what we focused on. They were this group of scientific and technical people were receptive to the idea, because it's clear that part of creative thinking is visual. In order to leap across missing information, for example, the language system is not very good. Brainstorming, for example, the research shows has not panned out very well because it relies on the verbal system. So the techniques that I'm teaching, using drawing as a means to see what problems look like, bypasses the verbal system and gives the person access to what you know that you don't know you know. In other words, what is in the visual brain, not yet accessible to the verbal, more conscious brain. Gets it out where you can see it.
About how long would this take someone? It sounds like it would take years of study to be able to access it.
No, I worked one day with Bell Labs, and we'll be working today with the students for 2 hours. You can transmit this information, you know.
Where do you see us headed in the 1990s?
Well, clearly systems are becoming more visual. If you think just of computers, for example, why is this? Visual information is very efficiently processed, rapidly, powerfully by the visual brain. If you think of graphs, for example, a simple example, graphs as opposed to linear, verbal, digital information, mind can grasp the overall picture immediately. Right hemisphere is extremely fast. Also, right hemisphere can deal with extreme complexity, whereas left hemisphere must deal with things one at a time. This is much slower. So the MTV, for example, presents bang, bang, bang images. And right hemisphere can deal with that, bypassing the left. Now, we need both, you realize.
Right. We talked about Einstein, and we talked about in school he was not one of the top students in his classes, and yet he had such significance as an adult. Could you explain to me, was he a right-brain person, or how did he?
Well, it certainly would be presumptuous of me to try to characterize Einstein's brain. You know, they saved it in a, and studied it. Did you know that?
No,
yes,
I didn't.
Yes. And they found, scientists found actually, neuroscientists, that Einstein's brain, from all outward appearances at cellular level and so on, was no different from the brains of ordinary people, even as you and I. So it is hard to say. The story goes, however, that Einstein had great difficulty acquiring language in his early years, but at around age 8 or 9 or 10, I believe, he apparently decided he needed to learn language, how to read and to write, and just very rapidly learned it. But I have to say that Einstein's son spoke of his father in this way. He said, my father was more of an artist than a scientist. And Einstein himself once said that all of his major discoveries came to him in the form of images, which he later translated into scientific terms and formula.
Have you found that to be true in other disciplines as well? Like
Oh yes,
mathematicians?
absolutely, absolutely. The history of creativity is full of this anecdotal evidence that major discoveries and minor discoveries come to a person in the form, as this aha of seeing the whole picture. Suddenly you see it. And as a matter of fact, you know, as human beings, when we truly understand something, the constant remark is, now I see it, you see. Mm-hmm. And this really is what one learns through drawing. You know, there's a saying in the art business that if you can teach a person how to see, that person is able then to draw. So what I teach is really not drawing. It is really perception, how to see what is really out there that the verbal system tends to mask from the person. We tend to see what we decide verbally we are going to see.
So how did creativity get linked up with drawing? A lot of people have this idea that if you draw, then you're creative, but they are not creative in their own right.
Yes, it's an odd concept, isn't it, that our students at UniverCity report over and over again that learning to draw made them feel themselves to be more creative. and therefore they were more anxious to try creative work. It's almost as though learning, I think, you know, it's quite like reading. A person who cannot read may be very intelligent, but they feel themselves not to be intelligent until they learn to read. That's the kind of stamp of, you know, approval. And I think it's similar with the other 50% of the brain, that a person feels themselves to be creative when they are artistic. Having learned to draw, that's the stamp of approval.
Does this apply to abstract and interpretive work, visual work as well?
Not really. Now we're talking about art, you see. What I'm talking about is training people in perception at the level of ABCs, at the level of learning to read and write. Now, some individuals, having learned to read and write, will go on to be poets and writers. Some individuals, having learned to draw, to see and draw, will go on to be artists, and this means modern art, contemporary art, abstraction, non-objective art, and so on. But that's a special segment of drawing and seeing.
I've talked with several people in the art department who have expressed to me the same personality traits that I tend to have at times, where I see this vision, but to get it out verbally is very hard. And now, does that mean that we're in the right mode of thinking and that it's something that is not translatable, or?
Well, yes, I suspect so. Right hemisphere is aware of the complexity of the whole. Left hemisphere must abstract out of that and speak in single words at a time. If you're seeing the whole picture, you think, I can't, you stutter and say, I don't know where to start with all, it's too complicated for words, in other words, if you'll pardon the pun.
So how does this affect people who may have what is termed a learning disability or stutterers? Is this something that they can learn how to get past that, or learn to understand themselves a little bit better in terms of their brain usage?
Yes, there is some work being done with stutterers that shows that right hemisphere is somehow involved. And also the dyslexic students, learning disabilities and so on, have some relationship to perhaps right hemisphere preference for learning. That is, some kids, I think, actually I think I was one of those children, simply prefer to learn things visually. If I could see it, I could learn it. But, you know, listening to the words, the teachers saying words, I simply couldn't grasp it. And as a child, I'm sure a lot of kids are inventing these things. As a child, I invented this technique where I would see the words as a stream on a tape coming out of the teacher's mouth, and I would read them off. And that way I could understand what was being said, you see. And children who are terribly visual, I think, are inventing these strategies for fitting material into their favorite learning mode.
Relaxation techniques, is that something that can access the right side of the brain too?
Yes, apparently so. Herbert Benson at Harvard has written about that. Meditation, for example, relaxation, causes a shift to right mode, so-called, a slightly altered state of consciousness, which is wonderful.
I've noticed in myself when I'm in my studio drawing and someone interrupts me, I get very, very angry. Is
Don't
that
you though? Yes. Yeah. Yes, because they've pulled you out of this marvelous state where you are alert, self-confident, focused on the task, doing well, doing your best work, and someone comes along and says, "How are you doing?" And the state is gone like that. It's very upsetting.
Okay, so this is a very fragile state to be in.
Oh,
then.
extremely. The telephone rings, you're out of it. That's why artists work alone. That's why writers isolate themselves, you see. That's why Niels Bohr, working on the atomic problem, went off by himself to be alone, you see.
Some of our people in our culture are very afraid to be alone. Is this because they misunderstand that state, or is this just a cultural thing that they have become too dependent on the left side to...
Oh yes, clearly. I mean, this constant jabber of left hemisphere, I think is quite addictive in itself. And, kids with rock music, bang, 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 MTV and so on. Yes, I agree. I think people are afraid of it. Actually, I've had students who became upset at experiencing a shift to our mode, feeling our right hemisphere mode through drawing, feeling that somehow a loss of control, which I think is the left hemisphere knowing what a wonderful state that is fearful that if you get over there, you won't come back. But, truly this is not the case because right hemisphere mode is so fragile. Now, mind you, drugs, alcohol, and so on also cause a shift to right hemisphere. And people long for this, which is perhaps the reason for using such chemical aids to making this shift. And this, as I say to my students, drawing is better, cheaper, it's legal, and you have the drawing to show for it.
I'm in right mode now. I'm thinking of 1,000 questions all at the same time.
Yes, that's it.
But I would like to know if there has ever been a question that you have not been asked that you would like to ask yourself or answer for us, because I'm certain from what I heard last night that you tend to get the same types of questions over and over. Is there?
Well, yeah, but often there are just off-the-wall questions which are really great fun. I can't at the moment think of a favorite question. I think one of the most frequent is the left-handed information, which is, I think, very interesting. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yes, I am curious if that has any significance.
Yes, most people are very curious about handedness. I am right-handed, right-eyed, and right-footed. And these are all outward signs of how my particular brain is organized. There are other signs, you see, placement of eyebrows, which help for you to focus on my dominant eye, which is the right eye. You'll notice that this is the eye that is listening to the words, is seemingly brighter and more alert, whereas the subdominant eye is dreaming away, you see, non-verbally, connected to the right brain, of course, left eye to right brain, right eye to left brain, which has language in my case. Now this all varies. We can have individuals who are right-handed and left-eyed and right-footed, called mixed dominance, which means that the modes of thinking, fundamentally different, are actually mixed still within the hemispheres. So a person left-handed who writes in upright fashion like this may have right hemisphere language location, which is simply a different location, left hemisphere spatial location, and perhaps some mixed dominance in terms of eyedness and footedness and so on. So more and more, in fact, individuals, young people coming up, are ambidextrous or mixed dominance. We used to, in the old days, left-handedness was punished, reflecting the bias against right hemisphere, you see. This was a, well, you could force a kid to change to right hand, but you cannot change the way that child's brain is organized. So that changing left-handed to right-handed often caused large problems. And the research goes on. It's a huge and quite interesting subject.
Well, Dr. Betty Edwards, thank you so much for talking with us today. I look forward to seeing more and more because it affects me as a person, and it sounds like it's going to affect a lot of us as we head towards the turn of the century.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Christine.